So we are Mark and Kevin, and we hacked the Tesla. So we're here to talk a little bit about what we did. So many of you saw a group of hackers here presented some research around hacking Jeep. It was great research. But what Jeep was only able to do is they actually had to recall 1.4 million cars. And that's certainly not good, right? It's imagine if you have to apply an update to your computer and you have to bring it to the shop to get the update applied, which is clearly crazy. We're really excited to say a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about, Tesla was able to fix just by pushing it over the air update, and it made their job a lot easier. They thought about security from the beginning, and that's really good.
So why did we hack it? Well, it's the coolest car on the road. It's got the most connectivity. It's got the most computer systems. And we thought, as a result, it's going to be the most interesting car to hack. But we also thought it would be a reference model for what's out there. We kind of wanted to see what the best manufacturer was doing, what the issues they had were, what the opportunities were, and also what were the cool things we could do with a hacked car.
So you may see a lot of these in your house right now. Well, maybe not the steel mill, but everything in the world right now is becoming connected. So there's a lot of industries had previously produced machines that were not connected to the internet. Now they are connected to the internet. And there's expected to be about 25 billion of these things. So you may think of computers as just the thing on your desk, in your pocket, but nowadays computers are going to be everywhere. And so we really need to make sure that ahead of all these things becoming connected, we make them secure. And so you might ask the question, as all of these companies start building things that are connected to the internet and they don't have experience doing that, they don't have experience in security and asking the right questions that a lot of you are learning today, some bad things happen. You might ask the question of, are there best practices? When people are building new systems, they might say, oh, I know what to check for. Is my data encrypted? You know, do I have a patch process in place? And if there aren't these best practices in place, then really bad things happen. Everyone just kind of doesn't pay attention to security and marches straight up into a pit of lava. If there are best practices in place, then even companies that maybe don't take security as their immediate goal, if they follow everyone else, they can be more or less okay. And so that's really what we're trying to do, is help get those best practices in place.
So first, we have a public safety announcement. You have to be careful. You have to be really careful when you hack a car, because a car is not just a computer. It's a computer that travels at about 100 miles an hour. And when you get things wrong, really bad things can happen. So you're not likely to see just the traditional kind of blue screen when it crashes. When you hack a car and get it wrong, it could really crash. So we created some rules of engagement. And these rules were all about making sure that we didn't do anything that was unethical, but also making sure that we didn't kill ourselves or destroy a $100,000 car that I can't afford to repay. The rules we had were, first of all, when you're hacking connected things, it's actually sometimes really difficult to tell whether you're hacking the connected thing or whether you're actually hacking the company that the connected thing's connected to. And we didn't want to accidentally hack Tesla and have them send the FBI after us. So first rule was to make sure we stuck only to the infotainment systems and didn't cross over into Tesla's own systems, didn't interact with any of Tesla's servers, and that we didn't make any permanent modifications to software. The last one's particularly important because when you're hacking the control systems for a car, and it's what you call a black box hack. Black box hacking is when you hack something that you don't know what it is. You don't know what the effect of changing some of the stuff is. That file that you just changed might actually control the brakes. And if you make a little change to it, for all you know, the brakes no longer work on the car. So we wanted to do everything in a non-kind of permanent way, try to stay in memory where possible, and in particular, not hack the car while traveling at 70 miles an hour on a freeway.
So many of you have seen these things called bug bounties. And effectively what it is companies say, hey, you can hack these things. You can go to this website and try to hack it, and you have immunity from law enforcement, from getting in trouble if you follow various responsible hacking practices and disclosure practices. And so basically what that means is if you maybe there's a website or a system, and you try to say, hey, find some sort of bug, whether it be a SQL injection or any sort of problem with it. If you promise not to destroy data or otherwise break the site for other people, and as soon as you find bugs, you tell the company, they actually allow you to go hack these things, which is a really great thing that a lot of companies are putting in place. Tesla put in one for the car itself. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is in the car. So it's not just a car. It actually has 3 servers inside. One of the servers runs the instrument cluster, which is where you see the speed and the functionality of the car right by the steering wheel. The second is the touchscreen called the CID. That's the big 17-inch touchscreen in the middle of the car. It's really cool. It has a web browser. You can browse Facebook, Twitter, so on and so forth. And then there's something inside the car called the gateway. And the gateway is how these infotainment systems, the touchscreen and the instrument cluster, communicate with the vehicle, the brakes, the acceleration, the airbags, and all of that. And of course, you can imagine the vehicle is really, really, definitely should not be hacked, right? That's very, very bad if that gets compromised. And so this gateway sits between the infotainment and the vehicle to make sure that even if the infotainment systems get hacked, you can't get into the safety systems.
So hacking the car was kind of like the Hacker Olympics for us. We literally had to use almost every discipline of hacking because to compromise the system, we had to go through all sorts of different little steps to get little bits of access. And this is kind of how a lot of pen tests work, although not quite as extreme. You might find that there's an open door that lets you get into the office, and then you might find that there's a locked cupboard which has a router in it, and so you use lock picking to get access to that. And then when you find that, you find there's a switch which has poor network access control, so you will use that to get access to the network, that kind of stuff. And this is actually very much how it worked with the car. We used hardware hacking, wireless hacking, network hacking, browser hacking, Linux hacking, binary reverse engineering, protocol reverse engineering, and custom tool development. There's a lot of stuff. And that's one of the reasons why it took us a long time. So, impact. What you're going to see in this next screen is a Model S with an SSH backdoor installed in it, and what happens after a little period of access. There are no car keys anywhere around. So what you can see is from the systems we compromised, we could pretty much do anything that the driver could do through the touchscreen, because by controlling those systems, we can control anything they control.
So how did we do that? So when you're exploring any system, first what you want to do is you want to figure out what you have to work with. In this case, a car, we actually had to disassemble the car. And of course, when you're disassembling a $100,000 car, you want to be extremely careful. So the screws that are used in the car, you can get from Amazon. You can get the screwdriver. It's a special security bit. And then if you're ever removing door panels, you want to get these orange door panel removers because it's very hard to remove them just with your hands. And you basically use the door panel removers to pry off the various panels. And you're really trying to remove these little metal clips. They're terrible, and you have to pull about 10% harder than you think. You think you're about to break this very expensive car, and then you pull a little bit harder, and then they all come off nicely. But they're really kind of a pain in the butt.
And sounds of breaking plastic are expected.
So the first thing we were able to disassemble was the instrument cluster. This is the thing right above the steering wheel. And so we pulled it apart, and as you can see, we opened up the circuit board. This is the front of the instrument cluster. And you can see, and what we're looking for is there anything that might give us some information? Is there a USB port we can plug into? Is there a memory card we can remove? Is there anything we can take a look at? Nothing here. And on the back, look here, we weren't able to find anything as well. So that really wasn't a lot of help. So then we went to the center touchscreen. This is the back of that center touchscreen, a lot of cables. If you're disassembling anything this complex, we'd recommend labeling the cables if they're not colored. Luckily, with the Tesla, they were all colored, so it was a little bit easier. But you definitely don't want to unplug 15 cables and not know where they come plug back in, because that could certainly be bad. We opened up the touchscreen, and we looked around to say, is there any other things that we could find? We found a removable memory card. All right. We found another removable memory card, two memory cards to work with. And then we found a USB port. Let's see what we can do with that.
Probably the best thing we found was a mysterious cable. I like mysterious cables because usually they're used for people when they're trying to fix the car, and that means they do special things. And special things almost always means access. We also found a number of different things like test points, diagnostic interfaces, the removable memory cards you mentioned, USB. When you're hardware hacking, you're basically looking for anything that you can use to give you some kind of access. If you think about this, on a server, you'd have a password to get into the server. By looking for hardware things, you're looking for a way around. It's kind of like if you were trying to get into a house and you don't want to go through the front door, you're kind of walking around it and looking for open windows that you can climb in through instead.
All right, so now that we have some memory cards to work with, some mysterious cables, let's go and see what we can do. When we look inside the memory cards, we found one which had a file called car keys. And inside the car keys, we found some really interesting things. These are cryptographic private keys, which are typically used to prove that you are who you say you are to some sort of remote system. That's very interesting. We didn't immediately know what they were, but it's certainly good. And then we had another card which had a bunch of map data on it, and a script that we potentially could run to gain access.
Isn't it cool that we've now reached a point where car keys are an electronic digital certificate? It's kind of a fundamental change in the way things used to be to the way things are going. And of course, the mystery port. Well, what do you do with mystery ports? You connect to them and play with them. And what we found with playing with this port was, it's Ethernet. And Ethernet is basically the physical network that you would find in an office that all the computers are connected to. The presence of Ethernet means A, we really are dealing with a server farm on wheels. B, it means that we can now connect into it and talk to those servers, almost as if you'd walked into an office and plugged into a switch and started talking to the servers.
So we started exploring the internal LAN, and the first thing we found was there's just a huge amount of data flowing over this thing, 500 to 1,000 packets per second. And so we almost had no idea, what do we even do with this? There's way too much data to even deal with. So we scanned using a tool some of you may know called Nmap. It's a really great tool anytime you're trying to explore a network. Very easy to use, and you basically say, hey, what is running on this network? We found a whole bunch of things, one of which is something called X11. X11 is what is used in Linux and other Unix operating systems to basically, it's the Windows of Linux, yes, well said. It's the graphical interface for Unix systems. And so this was about 3 in the morning, we had a long day of hacking, we found this. So we had a little fun and we decided to put some pictures up on the instrument cluster and the touchscreen. And then we looked at what else? What else can we see? One of the things we found was called the IC updater. This was on both the instrument cluster and the touchscreen. There were these updaters that when you asked it for status, it would send a whole bunch of data to you.
So with hacking, the more data you can get from something, the better. There's a step in hacking systems called enumeration, where what you do is you look for as many ways to attack a system or a company as possible. You identify all the different servers they have, and you collect as much information. So having something like this that just spews out information is fantastic. It told us all sorts of stuff about the state of the systems, the kinds of disks inside it, and the very last one you see at the bottom there, which was the most amazing one, this didn't appear in the first few times we connected to it. It actually only appeared when the car was waiting to download an update. And what it gives us is the URL to download the firmware. Being able to download the firmware is like the holy grail. What it means is we're going to pull down pieces of the file system, and that would enable us, prior to being able to get access to the servers, to actually look at what's installed on them.
So we found that this handshake URL, this exists, so we knew we could download the firmware. But as soon as we did that, we had a setback. And this happens a lot in long-term projects. You maybe have some progress, and then something happens, and some more progress. So patience is one of the most important things with any big hack. And what Tesla did is a lot of people on the internet also found that Ethernet port we talked about, and Tesla blocked it. So we said, oh crap, now we don't have access to the systems anymore. But we said, well, hold on. We do know that the instrument cluster above the steering wheel can still talk to the Ethernet. Well, what do you do with that? Well, we said, well, what if we get in between the instrument cluster and the rest of the car and actually hook that up to an Ethernet switch? And so what we did is we basically made these little cables that would plug into the back of the instrument cluster. What you can see there is actually Scotch tape, because you have to insulate the cables so they don't touch, the metal parts don't touch. And we couldn't find any cables that were small enough, so we had to make our own. Very high tech.
This is another kind of classic thing in hacking. You don't always go through the back door or beat down the security that's in front of you. Tesla built this very sophisticated, very elaborate method for authenticating anything that connected to that mysterious dangling cable. It was a great solution. You have to send a specific token to a specific port to say you have access, and then you can use the Ethernet. Well, instead of going through the really complicated and difficult process of breaking that security, we went around it, and we used another device to authenticate for us. This is classic hacker thinking. So by plugging a switch into the instrumentation cluster, the instrumentation cluster would authenticate our switch on our behalf, and we could plug any laptops we wanted into the switch, and we had access without even having to worry about Tesla's highly sophisticated and very elaborate authentication system. So, the breakthrough. As I mentioned before, the status hadn't been giving us this download URL until one day when there was an update waiting for the car, and suddenly this URL was there. And with the car keys that we found before, we realized we, A, have a URL inside Tesla's network, and B, we have a way to connect to Tesla's network. So we configured OpenVPN, which was a little bit difficult, but thankfully, due to incredibly verbose settings that you can set up in these things, it'll actually tell you a lot of the configuration you need. We set it up, we connected to Tesla's network, and we downloaded it. And I also have to point out that we debated this for like, what, 2 weeks? Yeah, about 2 weeks, because this was crossing the ethical boundary we had said of we didn't want to go into Tesla. And what we figured was, as long as we just acted as the car, did only what the car would do, then this was safe. And so we did it, and quite a large amount of data later, we had a file system.
All right, so this was a huge, huge step forward. We immediately decompressed the file system, found a bunch of stuff, and we just started tearing through it, trying to figure out what was in it. Are there any weaknesses we could use to take advantage of to get access to the systems? And so, of course, one of the goals of any sort of Unix system is when you see it, you need to get a shell account. You need to be able to log into the system and do stuff. But from the outside, we didn't have the passwords. We didn't know what to do. So of course, we said, okay, we have a file system. What do we do? The first thing you tend to look for in a file system is look for private keys. These private keys allow you to authenticate to a remote server and gain access to it. We didn't find any private keys. But we did find what's called a shadow file. So when you type in a password into your computer, that password is actually not stored in plain text. That would be really terrible. Instead, there's an encrypted version of that password stored. And for really complex passwords, it's almost impossible to crack them. But for really simple passwords, you can guess them quite easily, and you can crack them. And we ran this the shadow file through a password cracker called John the Ripper, free open source. You can download it, and it cracked in like a minute. This was not good.
Whenever you crack something that fast, it tells you that the password was really, really simple. Something like a dictionary word or a name. And I have to admit, at this point, I cried. I'm a hacker. I like really complicated hacks. And when someone gives something to me, it's really disappointing. It's like a big game hunter kind of stalking through to find his prey, sitting there waiting with a bow tie around its neck.
So now that we had a password, we could log into the instrument cluster. And of course, the next question is, okay, so you're in an unprivileged user. How do you become the super user, root? Well, as it turns out, the users was a sudoer, and which effectively means is certain users on any given system are allowed to become the super user just by asking for it. You say, hey, can I be a super user? And the system says, okay, sure. And that kind of sucks, because that was also really like, I was expecting to have to do something really complicated. So we went back and said, okay, we need to do more firmware analysis. And what we found was we wanted to get access to that center touchscreen. We, at this point, only had access to the instrument cluster. And what we found was the passwords to that center touchscreen were stored in plain text on the instrument cluster. So we could log into that. Also, it was kind of disappointing. We thought we were going to have to go through an elaborate hack, but we were able to get access pretty quickly. And again, also a sudoer. So now all of a sudden we have root on both the instrument cluster and the touchscreen. And it's interesting that we went through all sorts of effort, went through all sorts of dark alleys, and like couldn't hack anything until we got the firmware. Then the instant we got the firmware, literally, I think it was 3.5 hours from the firmware download finishing to having root on both systems. So it's incredible. So I would say anytime you're doing a big project, don't give up. You're going to think you're failing, and then all of a sudden you have one small breakthrough, and then 3.5 hours you own the entire system. And this is true in all things in life.
And this is actually a very common problem when you're dealing with security, even in the enterprise world. Often people invest all their security into keeping people out around the edge. Like, analogy with your house would be putting 16 different kinds of lock on your front door and making sure there's barriers on the windows and there's absolutely no way anyone can get through, but then you don't bother having an alarm system and you leave all your jewelry sitting out on the shelves and all your money sitting on the table. It's called the eggshell perimeter principle. The perimeter is hard and strong, but inside it's all soft and gooey. And this is the case of the car, and it's not good, because it means once you crack it, that's it. Everything's wide open for you. So, controlling the vehicle. We set up an SSH tunnel between the CID and the server to give us remote access into the car, and then use that to control the car. Largely because Kevin was okay sitting inside the car. I wasn't. And we were going to do things like turn the car off while it was driving, and I'd rather be at safe distance doing that.
So we logged into the car remotely. I'm going to turn on some music. My favorite song. So Marc just stopped the car remotely while I was driving.
And most importantly, I stopped the music.
And so really interesting that we found is when the car stopped, if it was traveling at very low speed, the car would immediately apply the brakes, all the touchscreens would go black, and you would kind of stop the music, unfortunately. But if we tried it at a little bit higher speed, like 6 or 7 miles an hour, instead of the car immediately applying the brakes, the car would simply shift into neutral, so effectively you couldn't accelerate anymore, but you still had full steering and braking control, which is really actually quite important. We didn't test it at very high speed for obvious safety reasons, but it shows that there's actually some robustness in the system, so the car is acting intelligently. If you're going too fast, imagine if it immediately like slammed on the brakes and like stopped the car in the middle of the highway. That would be extremely dangerous. And so it shows that there's actually some really interesting safety systems inside the Tesla.
So the next question is, what's Tesla doing about it? I have to say, working with Tesla was pretty phenomenal. Working as a security researcher, you engage in companies in lots of different ways and lots of different times. The process you're supposed to follow is called responsible disclosure. And responsible disclosure is that you take the vulnerabilities you find, you write them up in as clear a way as possible, and you give them to the company, and you give them enough time to kind of engage and work on the vulnerabilities before you do anything with them, before you go public or before you take them to conferences. Some companies will respond by dismissing what you find. Some companies will respond by accepting them, thanking you, and then going completely silent.
Or trying to sue you.
Yeah, well, I was going to get to that. Some companies send lawyers after you, telling you that, well, what you found is incredibly dangerous and therefore they need to sue you to keep you quiet. Tesla was the best of the best. What happened was they sent engineers after us, which in some regards is a little bit scarier than lawyers. They invited us to their headquarters. We had a really, really long discussion with them. They talked about the vulnerabilities, and most importantly, they asked us what would we do and how would we go about fixing this. And the result of that was they pushed out an OTA update, an over-the-air patch to the cars at ludicrous speed. So no need to recall the cars, just silently this update goes out overnight, and by the time we gave the talk at DEF CON, it was waiting on everyone's car. They fixed two of the vulnerabilities we disclosed, which is the weak CID passwords, the information disclosure, and other vulnerabilities are being worked on. But this was enough to prevent people from getting root on those systems using the method we described. And they also looked at increasing the hardening of the whole system, which is really important. It means they went away from that eggshell principle to having a strong, robust security model for all the systems in the car.
And I want to say, as Mark mentioned, they were really great to work with. They actually even sent a lot of their folks here to DEF CON. The CTO of the whole company came and actually thanked us and wanted to encourage more people to audit the car, which is really great to see a company saying, yes, we value the research that people are doing, and we encourage more people to try to hack our cars because they believe that when people try to hack their cars and tell them about it and are responsible about it, it actually makes cars safer, as opposed to just saying, well, you don't want to have anyone poking at the car and we just want to keep it all quiet because we don't want anyone to know that there are bad things in our car, right? And that's really dangerous, right? Because in the case where you have the good researchers finding bugs, you're going to have safer cars. But in the case where only the bad researchers are finding bugs, you're not going to know about those bugs until somebody dies on the freeway. And that's clearly not good. So in summary, we drew a picture of here's all the ways you can get into the car. And what you'll notice is at the bottom right-hand corner is kind of access to the critical vehicle safety systems. And you notice there's only really one way to get there. And that's actually really, really good. If you have lots and lots of ways to talk to the vehicle safety systems, it makes your job much harder for security because there's way more ways that people would try to hack in. And so the existence of that gateway is actually one of the best security measures of the car. I know that Tesla, we were working with them through this diagram we call the kill chain, where you kind of map out all the ways you can get access to various parts of the system. They're systematically trying to block different ways you can get access, not only into the system as a whole from that Ethernet port, but also once you're in one system, how do you block access between systems? Because you don't want to have this eggshell where it's hard to get in, but once you're in, you can get access to everything. You want it to be equally hard to get access to any given part of the system. So we wanted to use this research as an example, this best practices I talked about earlier, to really set an example for the rest of the car industry. Because if Tesla makes good cars but nobody else does, well, that doesn't really help the world as much as it possibly could. And so what we really want to say is, hey, what can everyone else in the world learn from what Tesla did right and what Tesla did wrong? And I think it starts with building an architecture that looks like the Model S. And what we mean by that is it has that over-the-air update process. And it's also really important that you don't have to pay any extra money for that update. It's really, really important.
Yeah, imagine if you had to subscribe and pay for a data plan to get your car fixed. I probably think about 20% of people out there would do that. So having this work as a silent thing is really, really important. In other industries, we've seen things like, if you look at all the ticket machines you use in car parks, a significant number of them are using software that's vulnerable and old and can be hacked. And the reason they are doing that is because it's really hard to take a thing that's bolted to the ground of a car park in to get it updated. And without an update mechanism, I think the only way many of them can be updated is a guy has to drive to them and plug a laptop in, so none of them get patched. That's bad for car parks. Can you imagine that with millions of cars on the road? We just simply don't want to go there. The next thing is, it's really important that the infotainment systems and the drive systems are isolated. This is kind of how they build airplanes today. It means that if anything goes wrong, and it doesn't have to be a malicious hacker, it could just be a software error, or it could be some kind of weird hardware malfunction. Nothing bad, no bad messages, no bad traffic can cross over and affect the safe functioning of the car. And then finally, each individual component has to be hardened. With embedded systems, the approach to security is a little bit different to the real world. When you're the server world, when you're securing a server, you know that you're building a box that's going to sit in a data center. It's going to be in a cage with locks on it, with cameras pointing at it. So in reality, the only way it can be hacked is by someone connecting to it through the routes that you make open. But with an embedded system, you're giving it to someone. They can take it home. They can dismantle it, and they can connect cables to every bit of it. That means any single piece of that system can come under attack. As a result, you have to think about that when you build it and make sure that every single component has its own security model and is strong enough that if it falls and is compromised, that doesn't lead to compromise of the rest of the systems.
And this is a slide showing all the people who helped on this project. There are nearly 20 people who helped make this possible. So, you know, any sufficiently large project, there's going to be a ton of people who contribute to it, and we definitely wanted to thank everyone else who put their nights and weekends, and one of whom lent us his car, his expensive car, and let us do wonderful things to it. And we couldn't have done it without all these people. So thanks.
So if any of you got any questions, please feel free to ask away.
This hack required physical access to the device. This wasn't an over-the-air app, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
We saw theoretical possibilities for remote access. As I mentioned before, we found vulnerabilities in the browser, but the point of our exercise was to see what happened to a car after it had been compromised. So we just looked for the fastest way in we could find. And when we found that, we didn't explore the other ways.
Which one of those two branches was is the over-the-air stuff? Is it on the infotainment side or on the...
It's on the infotainment side. Almost all of the access ways in are through the infotainment system, because that's the bit that interacts. That's the bit that interacts with the outside world, and so that means, you know, you're coming from the outside world. You have to deal with it. If you look at some of the really early car hacks that people like Charlie Miller were doing, where they plug into the CAN bus, those are coming from the car side of the network. Those hacks, I think, are going to become increasingly unlikely. For example, when you look at the Tesla Model S, the port that connects you to the CAN bus, the OBD2 port, actually has nothing connected to it. The only reason it's there is because there's a legal requirement for there to be one. So you're not going to see any attacks coming through that port in that car.
Yep. Oh.
You never talked about the USB port on CID.
Sorry. So we had to omit a lot of slides to fit in the talk. It's effectively NVIDIA Tegra is the platform this uses. So it's basically an embedded system by NVIDIA. And the USB port is how you do the firmware loading onto the device. It also supports firmware extraction, but it had a password protection enabled, and we didn't have the password. So we actually put the thing back together with a little USB cable dangling out of the dash and plugged it into his laptop, but we weren't able to get anything.
Think of that part of the car as being a giant tablet on wheels. And the way you would control an NVIDIA tablet, or say, for example, the Galaxy Nexus or one of those, is very similar to the way you control this. There's a piece of software like the Android ADB that you would use to talk to it at a low level and control firmwares. But as Kevin mentioned, there was a password on it. And while we probably could have sat there and worked out what token they were using for it, we found other quicker routes in, so we dropped that one.
Yep, back there. The question was, how would you recommend somebody get into car hacking? Very carefully. No. So it's an interesting question. So there's really kind of two general routes. There's the kind of the CAN side, which is like, you get one of those OBD2 connectors and you plug in, and if you go to the car hacking village, they have a lot of exploratory stuff there. And then there's the digital side of it, which is look at the infotainment systems, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. And I personally, I think getting into it, I think it's probably safer to explore the digital side and not touch the vehicle side, because if you touch the wrong things on the vehicle side, very, very, very bad things can happen.
I got a couple of quick suggestions. As mentioned with the OBD2 port, there are dongles you can buy for car enthusiasts that are read-only. In other words, they can't make any changes to the car, but they give out lots of statistics and information. They're used by people who like to drive cars really fast. You can buy these dongles and connect them to a car and then read it over Bluetooth. And that'll let you see what's going on inside the car side of the network. With that and learning about the CAN, you could understand all of the car side of things and how it works. I would also suggest talking to some of the automotive manufacturers, because I strongly suspect after what we've done, they're going to start holding hackathons, and they're going to invite people to come and start hacking, get engaged in one of those, see what's going on. Maybe just go along and watch, and then you should see some cool stuff. And finally, DEF CON has a car hacking village. You're going to see this in more and more conferences. Go there. You'll find people who have got a lot of knowledge, and you'll find systems they call bucks. And what a buck is basically the digital parts of the car taken out of the car and set aside for people to run tests on. Well, they're also great for hacking on, because there's no car behind it, so no risk. Go get access to those and play with those.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah, so with the OTA of basic, is that running over Wi-Fi, GSM, what was the
Yeah, so the question was the OTA update, what network was that running over? Every Tesla has a cellular connection. In the US, it's on AT&T. It can run over that. You can also connect it to your home Wi-Fi, and if you have home Wi-Fi, it'll connect over that.
you guys investigate actually firmware, changing shadow files, things like that,
So the question is, what can you do to maybe push your own firmware or modify it? The firmware runs over OpenVPN, the download, so it's not just the open internet. So if you could man in the middle of that VPN connection, which I omitted that, but it's actually potentially possible. If you could find a particular key that chains up to Tesla's SSL certificate authority, you could man in the middle of that connection and potentially push your own firmware.
But to be fair, as points out, we didn't really need to modify the shadow password files because they had really simple passwords in them. We didn't also mess with the car firmware that was bundled inside that firmware patch, because we could have messed with that on the on the digital side after it had come down, because we didn't want to risk it. They're all sort of digital blobs. There's no guide as to which bit controls which. And again, we just didn't want to get in the scenario where we change a few bits and find that that's actually turned off the brakes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.